Hi, you're watching Bloomberg Quint. Now, Ruchir Sharma, as all of you know, is a global investor, but that's not the Ruchir Sharma we're talking to today. This one is what some have called a limousine liberal, and I'd rather describe as an election tourist. Over the last 2 decades, Ruchir and a group of journalists have traveled through India during general and state elections. His book, Democracy on the Road, is an account of those journeys. It's a concise history of India's electoral politics, as well as a very engaging travelogue. Ruchir, thank you very much for speaking to us here
Thanks,
at Bloomberg
for having me. Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the many anecdotes that your book is littered with, and many of them are fascinating, and your many experiences with, all of India's leading politicians, I'd like to start with a slightly broader opening question, and that is, what do you make of the 5 years of Narendra Modi's government that we have witnessed, and the 5 years that are about to come to an end?
Right. I go back to the 2014 election campaign, which we went to. And in that election campaign, the mood of the nation was captured by the very high expectation that you had out of the government. So we went to Bihar and Uttar Pradesh for the 2014 election campaign in May of that year. And every time our cars would hit a bump on the road, the inside joke would be that Modi will fix it, right? That everything, it seemed, every problem would be fixed, because it really sort of, in that election, he was projected that way as being this big messiah who came to power. By 2017, when we went back to Uttar Pradesh for our 25th election trip, the scene had changed, obviously, in terms of the fact that it was taking a lot longer for things to get done. And you had the controversial demonetization, which had just happened before that, on demonetization. And I sort of remember meeting a former US Treasury official, and he made a very telling comment. And it's the title of one of my chapters in this book, called that Modi is more a performer than a reformer. And what he really meant by then was that he's very sort of focused on getting projects done. And, that XYZ needs to be done. And once he focuses on his attention on something and he works really hard at it, but there's not much big picture reform thinking that is happening as far as the government's concerned. By reform, what we mean is more of getting the government out of your way, because that's really what reforms in this country means. Some could argue demonetization was a reform step, but that's not really reform. I'm talking about getting the government out of your way, decreasing the regulatory burden, being true to your promise of minimum government, maximum governance. We just hadn't seen that. And I think that this election, therefore, 5 years on, is not going to be fought on development. I don't think that the Modi government's going to,
So no Vikas?
I don't think they will hear much of that.
Vikas was the recurring, was the echo, right?
That's right. But I think that you will hear the Modi government speak about their, sort of achievements and all that they have done. But I doubt very much if that's going to really resonate with the public out there. But simply because no government in this country, especially at the national level, is able to transform the lot of their people over 5 years, because the state is so badly broken. The delivery mechanism in this country is so badly broken. You want to give people a minimum support price, of farmers, but they can't get it because of the state bureaucracy, and they have to go and sell their produce out in the open market. You want to give farmers a check to encash, and many state banks will just sit on that for a long period of time and not clear the checks. So that's really what the plight of the country is. And I don't think there's been any architectural change in that. And that, I think, is going to be something which this government is going to have to grapple with as it goes back to the voters after 5 years.
But, you wear both the political travelogue author hat as well as the hat of a foreign investor that's looked very closely at India over several decades now. How do you assess the economic changes that this government is able to bring about, if any? And therefore, where we stand in the economy today?
As far as India is concerned, one of my favorite lines in the book is that changes upon changes, this country remains the same. So it's that the pace of change is always incremental in nature. So yeah, sure, you step back and you look at the long view, things change. But no government in 5 years is able to sort of do anything dramatic which makes a difference, or people feel it on the ground. It just takes too long to change the plight of people in this country. So that's really my feeling about this. And so therefore, even when you try and do stuff too close to an election to try and help the people are also very cynical about it. They just feel that this is just last minute stuff being done.
Vote purchase.
In a way that they keep the money, but they won't change stuff too quickly. So I think that is my entire point about this nation, which is that the change is always incremental in nature. Governments can come and go, and it doesn't really alter the trajectory of the economy. So I think that elections is a great spectator sport, and doing these trips for me is fascinating because you get to learn about India. We get to go to places in India that we would never imagine going to. But I don't think that it has any great significance or bearing on the economy or on the markets. It causes some volatility, but I don't think it sort of does much in terms of an enduring effect. And in the past also, if you look at it, what you thought an election would do to the markets and the economy didn't really quite transpire that way. In 2004, we were all shocked when the Vajpayee government lost that election, mayhem in the markets for a few days, and look at what happened after that. The biggest bull market in Indian history, partly because there was a big global boom which was going on back then.
Right.
2009, the same foreign investors wanted Manmohan Singh to come back. Their wish was fulfilled. He comes back, the markets limit up for a couple of days, you can't get a trade done. And then look what happened after those 5 years, which is that it was a terrible economic mess that we had to deal with and the markets had to deal with. So that just tells you that the effect of national politics on the market and the economy is way exaggerated as far as India is concerned.
Okay, so then divorce the politics for a bit, just for a couple of minutes, and tell me really what you make of the economic strength of this country. You know, and attached to that is a question that I have to ask, which is that do you even really believe what the data that you read about?
I've already made my views very clear on the data. In fact, you know, when in 2015, for the first time that they revised the GDP data in a long time, I was very, very sort of against what the new numbers told you, because it just didn't pass the smell test. And I wrote very openly about that. But at that point in time, I wrote that this was not out of any sort of malintent. It was possibly just incompetence that the government was keen to almost gloss over, because it sort of made them look a bit better, even though it made the previous government also look a bit better. But since then, I think that the data has lost a lot of credibility in the eyes of many global investors, and the media and the foreign media and all also sort of raise questions about it. So it's become much more commonplace to do that.
Right.
So now we have to look at all other indicators to try and figure out how exactly the economy is doing as far as economic growth is concerned. You look at a lot of high frequency numbers, car sales, two-wheeler sales, consumption metrics, to try and see what exactly is happening out there. So the data, I think, has already, you know, sort of lost a lot of its credibility out here, which is something which I said so even back then. Now, regarding in terms of like this economy, as I said, that the strength of this economy is the fact that the development seems to take place at a state level. So there are many breakout states in India in terms of how they've done. Arguably, even when Modi was in Gujarat, much more effective in terms of what he could get done on the development front. You have great success stories like Nitish Kumar.
In Bihar, yeah.
In Bihar, in the Hindi heartland, you've had great success stories in terms of the way that like some of the Bimaru states from Madhya Pradesh to Rajasthan have been able to transform themselves. Some because you can argue because of a good chief minister, some no matter which chief minister came that you will do that. But generally the story in India is one where you can get decent economic success stories at a state level and at some level that aggregates to being a good national story as far as we are concerned. But there are also other states which regress. Tamil Nadu is a classic example of this. This was a state at the forefront of economic development for many years, if not decades. And then when we went on our election trip to Tamil Nadu in 2016, it was quite clear to us that this state had regressed a lot, partly because of alcoholism.
There was an interesting observation that you made, and you've linked it to, I think, previous rallies that you attended, where free alcohol was the ticket to the entry to the rally. And you know, and you've written about how it then grew to be an actual endemic problem for society in Tamil Nadu thereafter.
It's a real vicious cycle that they are sort of, you know, stuck in. That at one level they want to give out as many goodies to the people as possible, but how do you get the money for that? So liquor licenses and having more liquor flow through the state is a way for the exchequer to get more money for that. But that is what almost sort of needs even more sort of welfare schemes to keep people happy, because you meet the industrialists out there and they were telling you that absenteeism was a big issue for them, of just getting workers. Now, you know, people who speak about it in such a common way was quite remarkable. So I think that that is really as far as India is concerned, which is the fact that these states also change as far as the pecking order goes. But if you talk to me about the resilience of India, it is about the fact that you have at least a few more development-oriented chief ministers who sort of know what to do. But having said that, even they understand that winning an election on the back of just development in this country is almost impossible.
You know, I want to dwell a little bit on that, but before that, continue wearing your global investor hat and tell me, you know, whether it's the data integrity issues or the institutional integrity issues that, you know, we faced over the last 2 years. And I don't want to make it sound as if they are, you know, specific only to this government. I think we've run into these time and again. But over the last 10, 15 years, we had come to a settled position about independence of institutions, about the quality of Indian data. People spoke, you know, not very highly of Chinese data, but they never ever referred to India in such a poor fashion, right? Yeah, they may have referred to not having enough data or having infrequent data, but nobody actually ever believed that there was malified intent in the data. So when you look at the economy today, when you look at some of the more short-term factors, for instance, a more dovish Fed, when you look at India's, you know, underperformance versus global markets, what does 2019 look like to you?
I think that the biggest risk to India currently, if you ask me, as I said, that the Indian growth story somehow seems to chug along no matter what happens on the politics. But if you're asking me for the risks in terms of what I'm looking at currently, it's the risk of competitive populism. And this is something which I think is sort of, we need to keep a watch out on that, partly because we expected the Modi government to sort of stop that, because in 2014, they seemed to attack schemes like Manrega a lot, or just the dole-out culture. Again, I go back to, you know, some of the anecdotes in the book, that 2013, when we went to see the Rajasthan election campaign of Ashok Gehlot, he was pilloried by the BJP back then for being this chief minister who just, you know, like is throwing one dole out after another. And, you know, Modi would say that he's insulting you by just doing this. And like, he wanted to believe that people want work, people want don't want dole outs. That's how he had positioned it back then. And here we are 5 years later, and even the Modi government now seems to be sort of, you know, going after one scheme after another and one dole out after another. So I think that that's the big change which has happened, that even if the Modi government is doing that, which was supposed to be more right of center as far as economics is concerned, then you can imagine as to what a slippery path that could be, because a lot of parties in the opposition, the Congress included, are pretty sort of spendthrift and quite happy to promise one thing after another. So I think that the biggest risk to the India story at present, as I look ahead, is this competitive populism, which is not about one party or one government coming to power. In other countries, it's a very different risk. In other countries, people fear that if, you know, for example, like in Brazil or some other country like South Africa, they want a particular leader to come to power because they think that he's more economic reformist and stuff. And that in many ways ends up being true. I think in India, the risk is a bit different, which is that this competitive populism, that if we end up getting, you know, these very sort of difficult verdicts where nothing is clear and each party wants to try and somehow get ahead of the other, what sort of promises do they offer to try and outdo each other at a time when we don't have the revenues to do it? The Congress government, like UPA 1, was also very spendthrift, but the remarkable thing then was that we were in the midst of a global economic boom.
So they had the money, right?
So
tax revenue was
they couldn't almost keep up with it, right? Because you would systematically underestimate how strong economic growth was, and you keep, you know, putting out one dole out after another. Now I think that the problem is you don't have that sort of economic boom, and this competitive populism, because people are feeling the stress and the distress, and you want to keep them happy by giving them one dole out after another, no matter which party you're from. So that, for me, is by far the biggest risk.
But is that a basis on which global investors actually estimate whether they still want to continue investing in this country, you know, incremental inflows? Do those things matter?
I think it depends which global investors you speak to. I think there are enough long-term global investors who believe in India, who think that that this country is starting off of a very low base, the penetration levels are very low, and it doesn't quite matter which government comes to power. And so the Indian growth story will continue to roll on, not at the pace of China, because we just don't have enough money to invest in infrastructure or other things, because so much of the money gets siphoned off in these dole outs, which China never did when it was developing itself in the earlier stages. But so I'd say that, yeah, you're right, that many global investors don't think that way about, you know, what exactly is going on in terms of it. But since you asked me about the risk, especially for the more portfolio investors, that's something that they may begin to worry about, is my fear, if this culture continues, that at some level, because in India, as you know, no one carries out economic reforms or does anything unless they have their back to the wall. So, you know, like unless you reach a point, even with the UPA government, it took the rupee crash of 2013 for them to stop this spendthrift ways. Until then, everything was about increasing subsidies and increasing dole-outs. But then you had the big rupee crash in August of 2013.
After the Tabor tantrum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you ended up having, even the UPA 2 government was forced to roll back and to sort of, take corrective measures.
Mr. Chidambaram came back as finance minister. Raghuram Rajan was helping him do all of that. I think that brings me to one central thing in your book that resonated the most with me, because I think for the last 5 years, we've been trying to determine what the economic policy of the Modi government is. And I don't think we have any commonly used phrases that actually fit it, right? You'd think this is the right of center government. You'd think that he won on the Vikas platform and the maximum governance platform, and therefore that's what he'd focus on. But we really haven't seen any moves towards reducing the size of the bureaucracy or, exiting from the variety of state-owned entities that India is invested in. All of this has been very, very incremental. There has been reform, if you want to call a bankruptcy law reform.
Right.
It's fairly basic. Most countries should have had it, and they, credit to them that we finally do have one. GST maybe is reformist in some way. So I'm not trying to undermine what the government may or may not have done, but I think it's fairly clear that we don't have political buy-in into any kind of deep economic reform. Now, I don't know, is that because the West professes a kind of reform that doesn't necessarily fit into India? So our reform is not your reform? I don't mean you as in the West, but I mean like as in global investors view it. Or is it that simply this does not win votes and therefore no government actually genuinely believes in it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the more of the latter, because you just compare to China too, that what's been the big difference between China and India as far as their economic growth is concerned? One of the big differences is that China invests, I think, nearly 3 times more in infrastructure as a share of its economy as India does. It's partly because they never believed in creating a welfare state. In the early stages of their development, it was pretty ruthless capitalism in terms of people migrating to the coastal areas in search of better opportunities and that freedom being allowed, and you almost wanted to push people into areas which you thought that they should be, which is manufacturing and exporting your way to prosperity, and building all the infrastructure to facilitate that, the ports, the bridges, the SEZs and other things. In India, we just don't seem to have that priority because so much of the money gets spent on these dole-outs, on these welfare schemes. So to think that this is just Washington consensus talking, that we need economic reforms or free markets, just look at the Chinese model too, which is much more infrastructure, much more sort of, productivity enhancing kind of spend compared to what India does. So, and the reason I think, like in India, as I said, but most politicians here, I think, you're correct, tend to be statists. They still believe
You've
in the
said
power
that in
of
the book, to quote you, India's political DNA is fundamentally socialist and statist. When I read that line, it was like this deep sense of despair, not because I buy into the Washington consensus, but it just because it tells you that the pace of change in this country is probably never going to accelerate. It is going to be what it has been on average over the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah, I think so. Unless we are forced to do something about it, I think that's what it's going to be. And the only time India has carried out transformational reform, as we just said, has been under duress, under intense pressure. In 2013, we discussed that the corrective measures started to take place after we were on the brink of rupee crisis. In 1991, it was obviously famous that. So all the reforms seem to take place when we are under real duress. Even the reforms of the Vajpayee era was because economic growth was so slow that they were trying their best to do something to do that. But so at that point in time, you can argue that there was a bit more of sort of feeling for reform and the thing. But subsequent, as I said, that the last 5 years, if there's any learning, it's been that even if a government which is described as right of center believes in doing so much of these populist, kind of schemes and hasn't really withdrawn the government, then this is really a country where,
What does that tell us about the next 10, 15, 20 years, Ruchir? You've watched emerging economies, you've studied them as part of what you do, you've seen how they evolve, and I can't for the life of me draw a parallel either between what Brazil has gone through and us, or Indonesia, which is much smaller and far less complex than us. So how does one understand? Because, I think through the book, and I think we should tell viewers this, you've written about how hopeful you were that India's leaders would embrace free market reforms. So you've started about talking about Narasimha Rao. You said, Vajpayee didn't quite have it in him. I loved that line. You said, to me, Vajpayee was not yet in that class. And that time you were referring to Putin and Erdogan and Lula as well. He was pushing some major economic reforms, but almost by stealth.
Right.
Almost as if he didn't want anybody to know, because he didn't think it was saleable, in some fashion. You've met Sonia Gandhi, you've met Rahul Gandhi. I don't know whether you believe they have conviction in many of these reforms.
No.
And now we've seen 5 years of Narendra Modi, who we thought, we started out thinking would have it, and has shown us that he doesn't. So what does that tell us about the next 10, 20 years
well, it
of
tells
politics, political economy and economic reform?
It tells you that changing this country at a national level is going to be very difficult, and you're not going to get the kind of breakthrough reform that you expect. The best hope for India lies in its states. That's where you'll end up getting more of a pro-development push. It's all relative, but on a relative basis, yes. And one thing I notice, even when I go back to New York, is the number of state chief ministers who now show up with their delegations to try and get more foreign investment is quite large. And
now we see that in Davos every year,
yes,
right?
and that was not like the case 20, 30 years ago. So that's what really the Indian growth story is going to be about, which is a collection of states.
I think as you've documented in your book, we've known as well, that there is no one winning element in an election, right? It isn't necessarily always caste. It could be caste, it could be onions, it could be anti-incumbency. You've documented that beautifully in the various state trips that you've spoken of. As we go into 2019, have you got any sort of grip on what you think some of the key issues will be? Distress, unemployment, jobs?
I really feel that this election is not going to be about issues. Obviously, issues will be spoken about in the campaign. But I think that what's happened in India now, especially with even increased polarization, it was always true, but even more so now, is that people's views on various issues is determined a lot by their political leanings first and their caste and religious equations.
What have your interactions with Modi been like?
It's unfortunately a bit contentious at times, because because I think that some people in our group in particular still feel very strongly about what happened in the past.
Yeah, I think you made references to Dr. Roy's questions.
Yeah, like in 2002, and I think that's what sort of that is something which has not been gone down well.
Yeah.
So I think that with both Mr. Modi and Amit Shah, the feeling that you get is the fact that they really haven't forgotten the media for the role that they think the English media in particular played in the 2002 kind of event, and they still sort of have a lot of hostility towards that kind of media. But as an orator on the stump, he's about as powerful as they come.
Yeah.
Our group also has some foreign journalists
right?
in there, and I remember that they remarking to me that they've seen many campaigns, and the oratory skills and the shout and call technique and what they saw, the resonance that he gets, is something that they haven't seen.
You've written about your interactions with Rahul Gandhi. You've written about what you all thought of him in 2014, where he apparently delivered a 1 hour, 45-minute monologue to your group on what he thought of India and its economy and its people, and then how he seemed to have matured into a more listening politician of sorts. I have a question. If for some reason the Congress does very poorly or does not fare well in this election, do you see Rahul Gandhi as having the longevity to come back 5 years later and fight even harder?
I'm not sure.
As a politician, I'm not asking about
it's
the political
complex
outcome.
picture, because Priyanka's now in the equation, and that.
What did you make of the man? I mean, you do this all the time, right? When you meet business leaders, you assess businesses, you assess economies. What did you make of his? Did you think that if he doesn't do well in this election, he'd still have the ability to come back?
It's very hard to predict, because these people, in terms of this, it's now the only profession for them. It's not as if they can go back to doing something else. Because it's too late in the game for that. So I think that it's very difficult for them to step off that. But yeah, if he has a poor result, I think a lot of the attention in the party, knowing the Congress party and its sort of love for the dynasty, will begin to sort of move to Priyanka automatically.
Yeah.
That's how it is. In fact, as I document in the book, that in the initial years, even after Sonia entered politics, everyone thought that Priyanka was the one, that she was the natural inheritor of the dynasty as far as the Congress was concerned. And I think there was a lot of longing for that, even until very recently, until Rahul began to show some signs of being able to lead from the front. And in fact, her coming now was a big surprise in terms of the timing. But yeah, if by any chance that the Congress again does really poorly in these elections, I think the attention will shift naturally to her.
Your reading of Mr. Modi, do you envisage a BJP government
One thing I've
without Mr. Modi at the helm?
Very difficult, because I think that the rank and file is sort of, very committed to him, and he has a mass space. And one thing about Indian politicians that is that very few of them, even after they lose office, lose their leadership of the party if they are very strong there. Because look at all these leaders. Every 5 years, Mulayam, Mayawati have lost elections. Vasundhara has lost elections. So many leaders I can count. Dev Gowda, Kumaraswamy. If they lose elections every 5 years, they go back and know that their turn after 5 years may well be to return to power. So very few of them, like in India, do leaders actually just fade away. It's not like American politics, which is very ruthless. That once you lose a presidential election out there,
you're virtually a non-entity, right?
Yeah, I mean,
you're only on the speaker circuit.
Very difficult for you to contest again once you lose that. In India, they all fancy their chances, so they'll come back. Often because in India, the election losses are quite marginal, and often because in India, the trend of anti-incumbency is there. That you notice that, okay, if today this person has failed, tomorrow I have my chance again. So that, like it's almost that you can almost predict that there's a merry-go-round, and your chance to be back in the spotlight will be there after 5 years.
Where are you going specifically? Because I know that you all carefully plot the areas that you traverse to give you a better sense of what this election is going to throw up. Since you haven't been through the campaign as yet, nor have we, I can't ask you who you think or where you think the wind is blowing, but where are you going?
I'll have to sort of decide that once the...
So you're the person who does all the mapping?
Yes, that's right. Well, mapping means that I'm the one who sort of organizes these trips in a way. So...
And so you decide exactly which regions, which areas,
I mean, I consult people obviously on a group, but in terms of that, I mean, this is like, for the want of a better word, my little baby. So this is something which I feel very passionately about. So I try and sort of decide that. So I will make that call sometime after the election schedule is announced by the Election Commission in early March as to where we want to go. My dream is to be able to go like on this election coast to coast, which is to possibly travel from Mumbai to Vizag. And because it would cover 4, I think, important states as we sort of make that journey. And partly because I feel that we've done too much of UP Bihar in the past, and we also need to focus a bit more on what's happening. I mean, there's no end to how many states you can go to cover this election. Maybe UP is very easy to do, but you get to hear a lot of that in Delhi as well. But so I think that is my dream for our 28th election trip. Okay,
one final short, quick question. Wear your global investor hat. Do you think the outcome of this election will have a kind of lasting impact on how the world sees India in terms of both the investability of India and the economic growth or potential of India?
Maybe in the short term, there'll be an impulsive reaction. But as I said, the connection between politics, economics and markets in this country is very weak. So I don't think that the election outcome is going to change things in a material way, the direction of this country. The only risk I'd look out for is the one of competitive populism. That if that really persists for too long, then we have to be a bit worried about that. Are we playing with the finances of this country? But I don't think that that I think the importance of elections on investment and markets is way exaggerated.
All right, we'll leave it there, Ruchir. I hope you enjoy your next trip, and thank you very much for sharing all of this in your book with us. Thanks.
Great, Monica.
Great speaking with you.
Thanks so much.